Have you got like a time that you've got to finish by? Because we do love talking, and we typically will talk as long as we're allowed. So,
Um, I have zero plans for the day.
sounds
I
good.
got my work done yesterday, and today I'm just kind of, and I just love talking about myself, so we can be here all day long.
Live from the Talking Joe Studios, it's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, 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 welcome to Talking Joe. Now, today we have got a very special guest. It is a bona fide G.I. Joe art legend. When I think G.I. Joe art, I think Rod Whigham, and we are honored to be talking to him today. Rod Whigham is a commercial and comic book artist. He began his career in the mid-1980s, drawing a run on G.I. Joe, a real American hero, covering most of issues 31 to 58, some iconic issues there. He returned for a one-off 78 and then a trilogy, issues 116 to 118, the Destro Search and Destroy arc. His comic career includes stints on many titles at Marvel, DC, and others, including Punisher, Star Trek, The Shadow. Since 2008, Rod has been the artist on the syndicated comic strip Gil Thorp. Now, before we bring him in, I will not be talking to him alone because I will be joined by my co host. It's Real American Tim. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners and viewers. Let's bring in that guest.
Let's do it. Here we go. Here's Rod. Hi, Rod. Welcome. Glad you
Ah,
could join us today.
well, I'm happy to be here. Let's hope that I don't wear everyone down.
Rod, sometimes I like to start not at the beginning, but at today. Can you talk about um, how it feels to draw a daily newspaper strip and how that is different than drawing a monthly comic book?
Uh, well, first of all, it's like it's extremely restrictive simply because of the size. So you're always having to deal with the limitations of how much you can fit into a panel because the final print size is it's sort of like a postage stamp, and you have to have a certain amount of breathing space for captions and lettering. So it's it's a very restrictive and challenging process. In comics, you have breathing room, like it's I've talked about. I like horizontal pans. I like vertical narrow panels that create timing. But in a comic strip, you are literally fit into these very restrictive spaces. You also have you're working for an audience that isn't really that literate in comics visual jargon. They don't have a lot of the basic knowledge of how to read comics. So you have to do a very straightforward. I'm not going to say simplistic, but it's a very clear, straightforward format you have to work in, and it pays the mortgage, but it is extremely restrictive, and I'm always trying to find a way to make the shots interesting, but they can't be complicated. And when I do commissions, it's like I get shot out of a cannon because I have breathing room, and there's so many things that you're capable of working with. And the problem also, you're feeding 3 panels a day to the reader, and so you have a very limited set of information you can give them, And also, it has to be just a simple, straightforward storyline. Because once somebody reads a daily, they generally don't have what happened in the first of the week at hand. You know, in other words, it's a very piecemeal sort of process for assimilating the storyline. So it's last year, the one thing I've been doing Gil Thorp for a very long time. Last year I had a lot of fun. It was an anniversary for the Flash Gordon comic strip, and the people who own Flash, although the strip's not getting printed anymore, published, they had a big anniversary thing, and they allowed artists from all over the country to do their version of Flash Gordon. So I got to do the equivalent of like a Sunday Flash Gordon strip that I wrote and inked and lettered, and that was pretty exciting. I made as much of it as I could, but it is a very restrictive format to work in.
Do you approach it in terms of just making sure that you produce one strip a day, or do you sort of hammer it and build up a backlog to release, so you've got breaks in between? How do you approach it?
A comic strip, a syndicated comic strip, is just a meat grinder, even more, I think, than comics. There's no breathing space, and I turn the whole thing around in like 2.5 days. So I'm penciling and inking 3 dailies a day, sometimes more than that. I also letter the strip, which I found really helpful, simply because of the limited amount of space you have to work in compositions. I can design the strips and put balloons and captions to create a flow. A lot of times when you see comic strips, it's lettered by, it can be lettered by somebody else, and they just tend to put the art, the balloons, everything right across the top of the panel. So you're getting a very constrictive area to work in. And by being able to do the lettering myself, I'm able to create a flow with the captions and the balloons, and it makes it easier to make more interesting compositions. But it is absolutely, it's just a machine that keeps chewing. You never get to the end. When you work in regular comics, you wrap up an issue and there's a psychological release from that. It's like you may have to start on the next one the next day, but there's this little treat that you can fire your brain on. But on a syndicated strip, it's just, it's never ending. It never stops.
Rod, there are stories of well-known comic strips where the cartoonist was going to take a vacation, so they either double timed and got sort of a week or two of extra strips done ahead of time so they could disappear for 7 or 14 days, or they hired someone to ghost for them. So, they drew 52 weeks and then 52 weeks and then half a year, and then someone did the strip for them for a week or two so they could take a vacation. Have you been able to do either of these two things?
No, not really. I'm gonna be polite as I can possibly be about working on Gil Thorp. Is that I take deadlines extremely seriously, and sometimes you work with people who don't take deadlines very seriously. There's a new writer on the strip. He's a young guy, and he's extremely diligent, but I never had any breathing room for however long I've done this thing. And the trouble with Gil Thorp is I couldn't find anybody who would want to fill in on it, because nobody wants to draw a football game. I myself am not a sports fan. The sports that I do enjoy are very peculiar. I mean, they don't, I like to watch surfing. I like to watch fencing. I'm fond of sumo wrestling, which I know sounds odd, but no, there has not been a single fill-in. I have drawn that thing through the flu, through family situations to deal with. You're always playing catch up. So that's the sensation of being in this machine, and there's no break for it. There really isn't. I would love to take like 3 weeks off and have an actual vacation, or just sleep. But it's an odd sort of thing. It's demanding.
Were you how aware of Gil Thorp were you before 2008 when you were reading newspaper strips, or when you were? Oh, guys, I see from your shaking head.
Had never heard of it.
Okay.
Had no idea that it exists, and it's been around for decades. But it's not a strip that I ever saw in a newspaper growing up, and it's been established.
All right, so to somewhat transition back to G.I. Joe, but I want to ask another question that's not necessarily 1984, the year. You have drawn many different kinds of comics, and you are drawing a sports newspaper strip. There are people who draw action or superhero comics who actually don't. That's not their favorite kind of comic to draw. You've drawn Star Trek and Punisher. You've drawn the Phantom, G.I. Joe. What
Shadow,
are the
Doc Savage, Terminator.
What are the kinds of comics you most have enjoyed drawing, genre or style?
I would have, I have done some superhero work. I mean, I drew some long, some 38-page specials of the Justice League for DC. I've drawn some issues of the Flash, and I enjoyed it because, as far as I'm concerned, that's easy money. But I was always really fond. I've always been fond of more realistic books or odd books. I like, my concept of heroes is somebody who gets knocked on their keister, gets back up, spits the blood out of their mouth, plants their feet, put their dukes up, and so the book that I enjoyed most of all out of my entire career was Punisher, because it's one guy. I was working with Chuck Dixon, and Dixon, he understands the value of action, if nothing else. And he also really gives you breathing room on the page. I did more double page spreads and extra splash pages working on the Punisher than with anything else I've ever done. I got stuck I don't want to say stuck because I was happy to work, but I did a lot of books like Star Trek. I did a lot of movie adaptions. I did books, Men in Black. I did books that had likenesses. And one of my least favorite thing in the world to do is to try and do a likeness of anybody. But, I'm kind of, I'm a realist. I like realistic books for the most part. So I would say that the book I enjoyed the most was The Punisher, because it was just, there was so much breathing room, so much action in it. And I wasn't having to please William Shatner or Sylvester Stallone.
Right. As I think I've heard that in the case of Star Trek at DC in the 80s, the rule was if that actors had approval for covers, and actors had approval for any page where they were the only sort of marquee actor on that page. And presumably sometimes an editor said to you, no, redraw this face, or, oh, I heard from Paramount you have to redraw this face. Did that happen to you?
Well, I think it depended on the film. I mean, on the books. Like with Star Trek, I think when I was doing it, I think the three primaries, Shatner, Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley, I believe, had approval. I don't know if they ever actually looked at this stuff or if they had somebody who delegated it. They delegated it to, and they were getting approval on that. When I did the Terminator, I did a Terminator series. It started at Malibu Comics, and then Marvel bought Malibu, and it finished there. I think the only person who had approval was Linda Hamilton. Is that the name I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Sarah
Connor.
Sarah Connor.
Yeah.
So it's quite different. I did an adaptation of the movie Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone had approval, and he was very hands-on. And the strange thing about that is I didn't notice he has a slight imbalance in his eyes. His eyes are a little not level, they're not center line. And as an artist, I just automatically corrected that. And then Stallone said, I understand, I'm an artist, is what he said. I understand what this guy's doing, but don't fix my eyes. So I had to purposely make myself straighten that out, or not straighten it out. And the funniest thing, my favorite likeness is when I did the Men in Black adaptions, and Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones both had approval. So I did the first 6 pages of the movie adaptation. They actually gave me an unfinished cut of the film. And Will Smith was pretty happy with it, but Tommy Lee Jones, this was the decision, the editor. I had done a very realistic Tommy Lee Jones. I think he's a fantastic actor. I love the guy's face, all the weathering. And somebody decided at Marvel that maybe that's a little bit too much. And they went in and took some of the lines off of Tommy Lee Jones's face. This is the story I was related to me. And at a certain point, the pages finally got to Tommy Lee Jones, and he's like, where's my wrinkles? So if you look at the adaptation of the Men in Black comic that I did for Marvel, and if you look at the 6, nobody went back and put the lines back in. So Tommy Lee Jones is about 15, 20 years younger than in the rest of the book, because Tommy Lee Jones is like, hey, I earned these. And that's kind of my favorite story on likenesses, but it's different with everybody. When I was doing Star Trek, the general idea I was given was do Shatner from Wrath of Khan. So that was the look we were going for.
And you were doing the book 5 or 6 years after that.
Yes. And I guess they just felt that was Shatner at his peak. But that's what I was. All the reference I worked from was from Wrath of Khan. And there weren't too many. There were only a few issues where I got to draw the series in the original timeline. Star Trek, the original series, whatever it's called. But I got to do the young guy, Kirk, and the young Spock. And that was really exciting because I loved that show so much when I was a kid. But it's a demanding thing. I think a lot of people try to avoid it if possible.
Mark, I'm guessing you have a G.I. Joe question.
Well, I was going to say before we get too far into it, let's talk about where you are actually right now. You're in your studio, so can you tell us about your studio space and the environment that you work in and the paraphernalia that you've got on your walls and all these kind of things?
Oh, that's a long story. Well, my wife and I live in a small town south of Atlanta called Noonan, which is it's a little college town. There's a small university here, and we have a pleasant house out in the countryside. It's not it's not a mansion, it's not a big place. So it's an intimate room, to say the least. It's a nice small room. I've had very large studios and small studios, and God, I don't know what to tell you about everything that's on the wall. Let's see. That is the Japanese theatrical release movie poster for You Only Live Twice, with Sean Connery. I still am a big Bond fan, but when I was a kid, I was crazy about Sean Connery. And so there's multiple Bond posters in here. I've got the poster from Russia with Love. I got the poster from, and Goldfinger. And this piece, okay, this is a classic right up here, Buy War Bonds. That's an actual World War II Bond poster, selling war bonds. Don't know the artist that painted it. It's a fantastic action shot. Let's see. I have a fair number of model kits. I like to build models in my spare time. And I'm particularly fond of aircraft from the Second World War. So there's, there's
just above your hat,
just above my hat, and over here and hanging from the ceiling.
Excellent. On fishing wire.
Yes, exactly what it is. I was born in the military. I was actually born on an Air Force base. I grew up, the first 18 years of my life, I was in the military, so to speak. And the old man was in Tactical Air Command. So I grew up around fighter jets. That's my whole childhood was on Air Force bases in different parts of the country and Europe. So I grew up around fighter jets and had a great love for them.
Rod, behind you is your drawing table. Gil Thorp, is it drawn in pencil and ink on paper and lettered on computer? Have you drawn digitally?
It's drawn. I'm analog except for the lettering. I pencil and ink it, and then letter it in Illustrator after I scan it in. I've used the computer mostly for coloring art. I've never had the urge to spend the kind of money it would take to get a sync and to draw digitally. I've often found that I can't get past it being too antiseptic. I like the feel of paper and canvas. So, I only use the computer for lettering or occasional coloring. But I'm an old school analog kind of guy.
And so when you were young, you're sort of growing up in sort of the I guess on Air Force bases, but going to school. Was arts a key part of your education? Were you did you realize quite early on that you had a talent for drawing?
Well, that's kind of interesting. I have I have zero formal art education. I didn't go to art school. I've always loved visual storytelling. When I was a kid, I read comic strips before it helped me learn how to read, but I was always fascinated with visual storytelling and design. And this is long before you guys came into the world, I'm sure, but there used to be a syndicated program on television, a little half-hour black and white show. It was called Learn How to Draw with John Nagy. And John Nagy was this slender, vaguely, I'm going to use this term, beatnik-looking guy. He had a goatee, so like in 1958, that's what it is. And it was a very simple, straightforward, syndicated drawing class. And I remember to this day, and I was, third grade, maybe I was in the 3rd grade. I was in New Mexico, so that's how I know my age, is like what country or state was I in. And all I ever did was teach pencil drawing. And I remember him drawing, and it was my first introduction to the power of negative space. He just did a drawing, very simple black and white drawing of 2 kids walking on a snowy field, and they're pulling a sled, and you can see a house in the background. And it's almost completely just white space. But he put the tracks of the sled and the footprints in the snow and created this 3-dimensional space with just these simple little spots of black and line work. And it just fired something off in my brain. And after that, it was all I could think about. I mean, that's all drawing has just been a basic need that I had from being a really young kid. And as far as education goes, art education, I graduated high school in a small town in Kansas, Derby, Kansas. And my junior and senior year, I had an art teacher, Richard Dolph. He was a really wonderful guy. He was very enthusiastic, and he would always, whatever there was to be posters or, stuff for sporting events or for plays, I was the guy he always went to. And he saw how interested we all were. A lot of kids, were into comics. And he got the idea, and he went and taught with a teacher who taught the printing classes. And he actually got us together, and we drew, inked, lettered, and printed our own comic books in high school. And that was my first great art lesson, in that I learned precisely what happens to art when it's reproduced. When you reduce the art for shooting, what the camera sees, what the camera doesn't see. And that's my single bit of formal education, is that in high school, I had an art teacher who just encouraged his students with whatever they were interested in. And I still, somewhere in a box, have those comic books. And that was my last shot at a formal education.
Did you and those other students make several different issues?
Yeah. Well, we did 1 issue a year because it took that much time to get around to it and to allocate the printing. And the year after I graduated, I did a story anyway and gave it to them. So I was like the I don't want to say posthumous, but there were 3 issues. My junior year, my senior year, I did a story, and then the year after I graduated, I managed to do a story and get it to my former teacher. So there were 3 issues altogether, and I had 3 stories.
So you had been looking at or reading newspaper strips. At what point did you discover comic books? Who gave them to you, or where did you get them?
Okay, well, I had, as a kid, I had access to them. You found comic books were in drugstores and grocery stores, so I'd run across them. When I was a very young kid, I was fascinated with the comics that Carl Barks did of Donald Duck. Carl Barks is like a great storyteller. He's a really wonderful comics artist. And I got very interested in that. And then at the beginning of the 60s, superhero comics finally came back. And that's when I discovered my first real run at comics was DC, because they were the ones who brought superheroes back. And I have very fond memories of those books. I liked the odd books. I've loved the Blackhawks since the first time I ever saw them. That's one of my favorite comic book series. Back then at DC, they still had the black uniforms. I loved the Metal Men, which was a strange science fiction strip about this group of humanoid robots. It had a very peculiar sense of humor to it. I loved the Doom Patrol. I liked stuff that was odd. There's a famous story that Archie Goodwin talks about that when he was a kid, he always liked the B team characters. He liked the weird guys. So when he was a little kid and there were kids in the neighborhood running around with a towel tied around their neck, they were Batman or Superman. And Archie said, well, I was the Green Llama. Which was a beautiful comic done by a great artist, but that was always the stuff that appealed to me. I was particularly fond of Adam Strange, and there was a backup strip called The Atomic Knights that I was just crazy about, a post-apocalyptic science fiction series with guys who wore medieval armor and rode giant dogs. I mean, it's just so bizarre. But the artist, the first artist that influenced me, and still to this day, is Russ Heath. Did a book for DC called The Sea Devils, and the first comic book, grown-up comic book I can remember buying was a copy of The Sea Devils because the cover was so beautiful. I opened it up and I've always loved Russ Heath. I love clean, graceful art. And I also was a huge fan of Ross Andru, who drew Wonder Woman, the Metal Men. DC had this great book, Star Spangled War Stories, and they had this World War II series where in the Pacific, Japanese and American soldiers discover an island that still has dinosaurs on it. So it's like every 7-year-old kid's dream to have army men and dinosaurs. And many, many years later, when I was working at DC, I tried to convince them to bring that book back, but it didn't work out. And so I was always interested in visual storytelling and, comics. There was the whole Renaissance, and then once Marvel came along, I've never understood the people's like, I'm a DC man, I'm a Marvel man. I've never understood any of that. To me, it's always the art and the stories. And but that's where it was. I was just a little kid who I just loved comics. I loved visual storytelling and didn't know really nobody I knew was involved with it. I was often odd man out, I guess is a polite way of putting it.
Was there a point where you grew out of comics before you professionally got into them? Or is it a straight line from making comics in high school to making comics professionally?
No, it's a straight line. Absolutely. I mean, with my lack of an art education and I'm some people think I'm overly modest. I'm not overly modest. My limitations as an artist has always been foremost to me. And that's the one thing I will say that the thing I'm proud of accomplishing is that I never stopped trying to get better. I'm still trying to get better at doing this. I don't see the point of doing anything and not getting better. Sometimes people, they have a certain amount of success and they kind of coast. But so it took quite some time to get into comics. I mean, when I still have somewhere, I guess I was 19 years old, maybe 20 years old. I still have my first rejection letter from Marvel Comics when I sent samples, and I got this form letter back from, I believe it was John Romita at the time. And it was pretty much, it was very polite, but it pretty much said, good luck in anything you want to do other than drawing comics. And I still have that somewhere. And it was slightly discouraging, but I had no other options. I mean, this is part of your blood. It's part of your biology, I think. And so I kept doing samples. I did a lot of work for fans magazines. At one point, I had some success, a minor success, with doing illustrations for like digest magazines like Galaxy Magazine and Worlds of If. There were like science fiction and horror stories. And I just kept going to conventions and showing my work to people. But it was a drawn out process, to say the least. And I have to say, I don't pay as much attention to comics as I used to, because at a certain point, it all sort of melded into this single thing. I think the 90s really sort of comics contracted, and it was all just superhero stuff, the majority of it. And there were certain style changes that I just sort of lost interest in it. But I've never stopped loving comics. I still love comics. I guess I'm old fashioned. I like black on the page. I like feathering.
So what was the turning point? So you've graduated from high school, you've put in some samples and been rejected. You've been going to conventions and showing your portfolio. Where did the sort of the big break or the turning point land?
Well, I kept sending Xeroxes. I went to conventions. I got up to my early 20s, and I started, going to New York and leaving my portfolio at Marvel in DC and waiting and going to conventions. And I got to a certain point to where I would meet with editors or people at conventions and go, you're almost there, or you're there, but I don't have anything for you right now. So it was a procedure of getting to a point to where you realize that maybe you're good enough to get in the door, but then you also have to deal with the fact that there's so much material going through editors' offices. A lot of people, and at that time, basically, you had two places to work. You had Marvel, you had DC. There were smaller publishers that were coming and going constantly. So I guess my big break, if I want to put it that way, as far as comics, is I had been attending a big convention here in Atlanta. It was called the Atlanta Fantasy Fair. And every year when the convention came around, they would print their own comic. That's, again, any time you can get something through a printing press, it's a learning experience. It's valuable. And I co-created a science fiction adventure strip that every year a new chapter would come out in the convention. It was a combination convention, pamphlet, and comic book. So at a certain point, what happened was, the first thing I would say that would be considered professional comic publication is that there was a publisher called Dawning, and they produced graphic novels of pre-printed material. Wendy Penny and I think her husband had a series called Elf Quest that was like a fantasy comic book that had a very strong fan base. And Dawning got a deal with them, and they reprinted the comics in trade paperback. And Wendy went in and colored the art, and they reprinted it, and they were looking for material. So it took the strip. It was a thing called Light Runner. It was kind of a Andre Norton, pre-Star Wars adventure series. and they were interested in it. And I had drawn 3 chapters, and they said, well, we need this much of a page count to do the book, to make a trade paperback. And they were willing to wait for me to finish it, because apparently they were happy with what they were seeing. So it was this bizarre concept, but the first chapters of the book, my stuff was so much raw that it wasn't balanced, that I went in and I redid the first chapter of the book and then produced the balance of the book. It was a 112-page graphic novel in the long run. And I co-created it, sort of edited it, I penciled it, I inked it, I drew the word balloons, I did the covers for it, and it was released. Dawning took it, they published it. And so the first thing that I ever had professionally published was something that I had created, penciled, inked, I colored everything. I mean, it was so when I went in, finally got in to go into the offices, people said, well, what have you done? I dropped a 112-page graphic novel. And they said, well, what part of it did you do? And I said, all of it. And they said, what do you mean all of it? I said, I created it, I penciled it, I inked it, I colored it, I drew the word balloons. And so it was a tangible thing. I mean, it was like this was absolute proof that I could do the job. And I got in at Marvel because there was a convention in Atlanta, and I went there with a copy of that book and samples, and Shooter was the big guest. And so I went to the convention, he was there. And I came up and brought my portfolio, and he was actually, he was actively looking for people. He was looking for work, and I showed him my stuff. And while he said, your figures just if you got this but he said, this is what I've been looking for. I can look at the page and I can tell what's happening. You do storytelling. And so what he said is, I'm going to try and find you a script. And I'm like, if I could have done a cartwheel, I would have been doing cartwheels. It was quite exciting. Time passed. I mean, the guy was the head of the company and he was very busy. And finally, at a certain point, after 6 months of waiting, Chris Claremont, who I had met at the convention, he said, look, you need to come up here and force his hand, because he's got all this stuff going on all the time. So I went to New York. Chris graciously let me stay at his apartment.
Wow.
And it sort of forced, I'm there, I'm here, here I am, I'm in New York City. And Shooter came up with a script. And then that turns into a whole nother story that I won't go into. But that's how it was. I did every single thing I could do to get published. I worked for fanzines, I worked for small publishers, and then I did a graphic novel that I did the whole deal on. And that was kind of like, people are used to seeing pencils. Somebody comes in, they'll show you a handful of pencils or some inks. And I walked in and I put down 112-page printed, bound, full color graphic novel that I had done for a ludicrously small amount of money. But that was my calling card.
And listeners and viewers curious to read Light Runner, it was reissued in 2017.
Yes. It was Dover Books decided they started to look, they were going to start reprinting comics material, and it was reissued. And
how many pages did you redraw this time?
I didn't redraw anything. I had the luxury of just looking at it, looking at everything I did wrong, fighting my gag reflex, and say, "Here."
For this new edition, did you have the original artwork or original films, or is the new printing scanned from the original comic?
The new printing is scanned from the original printing.
Okay.
It doesn't look awful.
All right, so you might suggest, if people are interested, that they track down the 1983 edition.
If they can find it.
Okay.
It was also the original edition also was put out as a limited hardback with a dust cover, a slip cover, which unfortunately I did not have anything. I didn't have any say-so about what was done with that. And they put it in white leatherette with bright blue lettering, and it looks like a high school yearbook from Tucson, Arizona, about 1971. I'm just, my God, black leatherette, red lettering, for Pete's sake. But it looks just like, it is one of the ugliest things you've ever seen in your life. But it's, it's white, white leatherette. But bless their hearts.
I've long wondered when it was that when you actually sort of got published by Marvel. I've wondered to myself, how are you so good out of the gate? Because a lot of artists, you see them really developing on the page. That first time they're published, maybe they're not quite ready. It looks for your first work at Marvel, it looked very, very polished. And now I realize it's because you had a single-minded determination to keep on, drawing for probably the best part of over a decade without landing a major publisher. So all of that learning has kind of been happening outside of the press, I guess.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, and I do function on this idea that whatever you do, the next thing you do needs to be a little bit better. And I have mixed feelings about what I did on Joe. I had so many limitations in my drawing, but especially with figures. But the most important thing to me, and it's always been the most important thing to me, is telling a story. And that sometimes gets lost, I think. Certainly there was a period of time with comics where you would flip through a comic and all you saw were huge figures jumping off the panel. I mean, the 90s really sort of, everything turned into a Michael Bay film, if I can be that rude. But yeah, and also, the people that I chose to study, while it dated my work a little bit, were the people that were great comic storytellers. Ross Andru is an underappreciated artist and a great storyteller. Russ Heath is a great storyteller. I idolized Wally Wood, who was a great storyteller. Another major influence on me was Russ Manning, who did the Tarzan comics, and one of my favorite comic books of all time, which is Magnus Robot Fighter. I don't own a lot of original comic art, but I have several Russ Manning Magnus pages hanging in my house because I loved his work so much. But it was all storytelling. And I mean, that's literally what got me in the door at Marvel, was that I think it was Gil Kane who was very kind to me, the great Gil Kane. And one of the things that he told me is like, when you draw a comic book page, if you can't take off the dialogue and the captions and word balloons, everything, if you look at that page and you can't tell what's happening, then you've failed. If you can't tell the emotional reactions from the characters, if you're as a reader, you don't know what's happening, that you failed. So that was always at the core of everything I did, was telling a story.
Rod, your sample for Marvel, your primary sample was you penciling and inking.
Yes.
There weren't a lot of people at Marvel in the 80s who were penciling and inking. When you penciled G.I. Joe, Andy Muschinski inked your work. Was it ever any of you? Did you have a goal that you would be penciling and inking, or was that just wasn't going to happen with someone new? And did you have a relationship with Andy Muschinski?
Well, I really enjoy doing a piece of art from start to finish. And a lot of people are surprised if they're at conventions and they look through my portfolio, because I work in different styles. I have a minimalist style. I idolize Alex Toth. And I have some styles that are cartoony. I have a style that I do that it's vaguely like Mike Mignola. But to work in that sort of way, you have to be able to do the entire job yourself, or to be able to work with an inker who understands what you're going to do and complete it. But I talked about the grinding machinery of publication. You just don't have enough time. I mean, there are people who are brilliant. I mean, I idolize Walt Simonson, and when you have to be an exceptional talent, and you have to be able to work on material where you can have that kind of control. I've met Andy. Andy was a lovely person, and I thought that his style was, I felt slightly bad because, he would get this stuff with all this detail on it. And part of the appeal, what I saw in G.I. Joe, what I thought was a large part of the appeal was a toy line, was that it was set in the military, that there were these vehicles. And having grown up around fighter jets, I knew that some of the appeal of the book was the equipment and the machinery. So I was very big on detail. I like a lived-in world. So, but I'm sure Andy was, it was, I made a lot of work for the guy. And I thought he did very good. I mean, and there were a lot of people that worked on the book before me that were much better. Mike Vosberg is a really good artist. I think Frank Springer is a good artist. But so I never really. I met Andy at a convention and we hung out, but it was never much of a working relationship. In that, you got to be at the drawing board. I got to be penciling. You got to be inking. But I was perfectly happy with it. I think Andy was better at the job than I was.
And when you got this job, you no longer stayed in New York. You went back to Atlanta.
I never lived in New York. I've never moved out of Atlanta, which sort of that was part of the problem, was that I wasn't there constantly to harangue editors, to hang out around the office. But it's expensive to live in New York. And I'm trying to, it's just like, well, how am I going to be able to live there and not be in or an old refrigerator box under a bridge? And I was married at the time that I was trying to break in. That thankfully got resolved. And then I met a woman that I was crazy about, and we got married. And she had a son from her previous marriage. So relocating to New York then was like, it was out of the question. So I did it the hardest possible way you could. I never went to New York. I just went to every convention. I would go up there there are times. One time I went up there with a friend of mine, and we were going to stay at his buddy had an apartment. We were going to stay there. And we got off the plane. We're in New York. And I'm like, well, where are we going to go? We got to go to this guy's house. He says, well, I got to find him first. So we're like, I'm sitting in New York City with my portfolio in my hand and like maybe $30. I mean, and we're trying to track down this guy so we'll have an apartment to sleep in for the night, because we didn't have the money to go to, to get him a hotel room. So it was pretty exciting.
And how does one go about getting an invite to stay at Chris Claremont's place?
Well, I had met Claremont at conventions. My former wife was a cosplayer. She was she was sort of a premier, a renaissance in cosplaying. It just started coming up, and she made X-Men costumes. Wow. She made Phoenix and Dark Phoenix. She was very attractive. And I think that was my way in with Chris Claremont. But he's a lovely person. And it was funny because when I came up there and like, Jim's he's going to get you a script. He's working on it. And I'm like, okay. And then he said, well, and he took me around the offices at Marvel to talk to editors. And that's a whole nother story. And then he said, well, you know what? I'm going to take this guy over to DC. And the people at Marvel are like, well, why are you doing that? And he was kind of hedging the bet. And I went to DC and met with Lynn Wein, who was an editor and a writer, a lovely person, a really great guy. And he was like the Chris Claremont. It's like, why have you brought this guy here if he's at Marvel? And he's like, I'm trying to move things along. And I'm so unsophisticated, I didn't even understand what was going on. But Lynn Wein was really great. And it was a weird coincidence too. I had this Iron Man sequences, 2-page Iron Man sequence that I had done, just for samples. And there was this weird villain at Marvel. There's a guy called the Absorbing Man. He was a Thor villain, but he was dressed like a guy in a chain gang. He actually had like a ball and chain, but he had the ability to absorb. He would turn into whatever he touched. He'd be steel or concrete. I'm pretty sure he was a Thor villain, but it was just so bizarre and absurd. I loved it. So I had this sequence, and it was a splash page of like Iron Man and Crusher Creel smashing out of an airliner, falling into the camera. And so I go to DC and I'm doing this stuff, and Lynn Wein goes, oh, wow. And he picks it up. Crusher Creel, the Absorbing Man's my favorite villain at Marvel. I was like, that's really strange. But he was like, well, I'll show your stuff around. They made copies. He showed stuff around. And time passed. And I finally got a call from Marvel. And that was to do a fill-in on G.I. Joe. And I'm like, oh my God, all these years, all this I'm trying to do. The next day, literally the next day, I got a phone call from Marv Wolfman wanting to know if I wanted to draw a sample issue of The Vigilante, which was DC's version of The Punisher. And after all that time, all the trips, all this stuff, everything, it's like one day I get the call from Marvel, the next day I get the call from DC. And I told Marv, it's like, I would love to do it, but when does it have to be done? I just got accepted fill in at Marvel. And I think I kind of upset him. I got him. I was gracious about it, but he was like, I'm going to give this guy his career. And that was it. So it's a very peculiar kind of thing, that story. I hadn't thought about that story for a long time, but I had banged my head against the wall and stood in the rain and left my portfolio and talked. and waited and waited. And one day Marvel calls me, and the next day DC called me. And this is several months afterwards. So,
and you also got spotlighted in Marvel Age as well, which I guess must have been before you were offered the G.I. Joe gig. That you were featured as a new talent.
yes. Well, there's an involved story behind that, but I'm trying to be. I got in the door at Marvel. I got caught up. There was a lot of inter-office politics at Marvel, and I sort of walked into the middle of it. And anyway,
is that something like one editor is responsible for certain characters, certain books, another editor is responsible for different characters, different books, or one artist is supposed to stay with one editor, that kind of thing?
It was something like that. There's no simple way of explaining this. A script was given to me, and the script that was given to me had already been rejected by the editor of the book. And the person who gave me that script did not know that. And somebody, it's a long, involved story.
And you drew that script. Is that
no?
Okay.
I started working on the script, and then this is all inter-office stuff and personalities, and I don't want to get into it too much, but the plug was pulled on the job that I was given. And it was a difficult situation.
But then you got G.I. Joe.
And I thought I was done at Marvel because I got into the middle of this. I walked in there, la-di-da-di-da, this is the great thing. And then I sort of had inter-office conflicts blow up in my face. A lot of people don't know this story. And I had started working on the story. It was a terrible story. The editor on that, who had rejected that script, said, I was told from someone who firsthand knew it, said that the editor who rejected the story said it was the worst piece of you-know-what that had crossed his desk in 2 decades. So I thought I had got in the door, and then I got blown out of it. And I came back to Atlanta, and I was very depressed. And time passed. I went to a convention in Atlanta, and the editors, Bob Budiansky and Jim Salicrup, did Marvel Age. And they saw my stuff at the con, and they went, wow, this is really good stuff. We'd like copies of this, and we could put this in our Marvel Age as possible new talent. They didn't know the story of what had happened. And then and if you read there, it's like, oh, we had a little catching up to do. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what that was. So without naming names, I thought I had got in the door at Marvel. I got kicked out the door at the same time, like less than a week later. And then time passed, and then editors at Marvel who were at the convention and didn't know any of that story said, wow, we're going to publish you in a Marvel comic. We're going to see if we can get you new talent. And I got this big, rather elaborate spread.
When you were drawing G.I. Joe.
Sorry, I had. Yeah,
no. I'm sorry.
It's a funny story.
I love
all
that.
These years later.
When you were drawing G.I. Joe, what reference were you getting for the action figures and the vehicles?
Well, they gave them all to me.
The toys.
I had the world's greatest G.I. Joe toy collection.
Okay. So
and like an idiot, I took them out of the boxes. I put them together. like so I could draw them from different angles. And then, like an idiot, later on, after I was done with the book, I gave them everybody I knew who had kids. I gave them all to. I just gave them all away. If I left them in the box, God only knows. Let's not talk about money.
Right. If you'd left them in the box, though, you wouldn't have drawn the book very well, and you wouldn't have stayed on the book.
Well, that's kind of it. But I did have one of the great GI Joe collections in the world because I just had tons of it. I kept one GI Joe toy. I have one toy. I'm going to be off camera for just 1 second.
Mark, place your bets. It's probably not the flag.
What will it be?
What could it be? What could it
The
possibly
Thunder Machine?
be?
That's my. I'll say.
Are you ready?
Devilfish. Oh, neat.
Oh, the Mola.
Yep. Essentially, their version of the M1 Abrams, and it's powered.
That's great.
I'm very fond of tanks, so that's the single toy. It's one of the most impressive ones. It's beautifully detailed, but that's the single GI Joe. I unfortunately, like an idiot, gave them all away. I had my stepson got all the aircraft. He's actually a pilot. He's an airline pilot, but that's the single one I got left. But yeah, at one point you go into my studio. Well, it's ridiculous to say it's any different now. I mean, I have more toys in here than any 68-year-old man should have.
I think, Rod, actually it's the keeping of toys and the drawing of adventure that is keeping you young. And so it's not a bad thing that you have toys, you have children's objects in your studio. I think it's an excellent thing.
Well, I also, I'm a designer. I mean, I'm an artist, but I think I'm more of a designer than a fine artist. And I love design. I mean, if I'd had the money for an education, I would have liked to have gone to, a design school. I mean, I would have been perfectly happy designing cars if I could have. I would have made a lot more money. But I love design of all kinds. So there is a lot to be said for that. I mean, my feeling is you have to grow old, but you don't have to grow up. I mean, I don't like grown-ups. Everything that's wrong with the world across the board is the direct responsibility of grown-ups. And
those guys.
You pay your bills. I mean, I have earned, back when it mattered, I had quite a reputation. It's like, if you need something done, give it to this guy, it'll get done. I got books that nobody else wanted to draw because they were difficult, and I always got them and they were behind schedule. So I was lucky to do what I love to do.
So when you were given the first issue of G.I. Joe to draw, you described that as a tryout. So it wasn't given to you as a full-time gig. It was, let's see what you can do. And if you do it well, then maybe there's more. Well,
that's every job you ever do is a tryout in some ways. There were, my understanding is Joe was often late because it's so demanding. I mean, of course, the early issues of Joe, there were like 8 characters and 5 vehicles or something. I mean, I got handed the book at a time when the line exploded, and I was keeping track of 40 or 50 different characters with different uniforms and all these vehicles. But I did the fill-in, and they were trying to balance getting on time. And there was an issue where multiple people worked on it. A very talented guy named Mark Bright. It was like there's 3 or 4 different artists that drew it. I don't remember which issue it was. It starts off with a ship, like a freighter at sea or something.
Yeah. 35.
And there's there's Mark Bright, who He's a very talented guy. I really liked him. I think he went to DC and drew Green Lantern, but he was better than I am. Certainly was at the time. And I don't quite know the process, but I did have a hand. I have an ability to draw technically. So the vehicles, the tanks, aircraft, all that sort of stuff, I was able to do. And I think that was anathema to a lot of guys who worked on the book.
I think what Mark is partially asking is, you drew issue 31. And then
Wait, that was going to be the question. What was the first? Do you remember the first issue that you worked on? What was the story that you drew?
The first issue that I drew was the one where, God, I'm pretty sure the first one I drew was the one where Destro and some other Cobra guys track down Snake Eyes to his cabin in the mountains.
That is 31.
And Firefly is in it. That drops a satchel bomb down into his cabin. Yeah, that's so cool. That's the first one. So
I think what Mark might be getting at is, you drew 31, and then Frank Springer drew 32 and 33. And your full regular run begins with 34. And I think what Mark and I are trying to figure out is, at what point in the schedule does Marvel sort of get back on track, or realize it's back on track, or it's like, okay, this new kid, if we put him, Springer's already doing 32 and Whigham's doing 31, we'll have Springer do, this is my guess, we'll have Springer do 33. And then when we get the script for the plot for 34, the new guy will start on that, something like that, to sort of right the ship.
I would, yeah, that sounds right to me. Is 34 the fighter jet?
Yeah, Shakedown.
That's right.
Shakedown. Yeah, that's over the years at cons, and a lot of people, a lot of kids. It's like, I've had kids. Well, they're not kids anymore, but I've had people tell me that they never read comics and they saw that issue on the stand. But, you know, a lot of it were those incredible covers that Mike Zeck did. I mean, those G.I. Joe covers by that guy were wonderful. I think Hama designed them, but I was 800, 900 miles away. I didn't even know, but yeah. And at some point I started drawing several issues, and at some point I was on the phone, or my former wife was on the phone with Don Daly, who was an assistant editor, and kind of like, well, is he drawing the book or not? Because nobody, I wasn't officially told, here you go, kid. And the assistant editor said, oh yeah, he's drawing the book. So I'm like, well, that would have been a nice thing to, I would have liked that phone call instead of like secondhand.
And as your first gig, sort of on that issue 31, what was your speed like? Because obviously there's going to be this tension, get it to them quick, but also this is my first time doing a monthly book, and I want it to be as good as I can possibly make it. How do you think you managed that?
It was ridiculously overly detailed, but I've always felt that, and it's certainly in books like this, that detail is part of it. I think there was a lot of kids who read the book liked my work because I had a realistic, detailed style. Oh, I'm sitting here and looking at this stuff. Oh, God, I was so terrible.
I think it's amazing, but
that's what it was. It just, as far as that, I believe I did it. Well, they told me it had to be gotten in, but I don't think I was doing better than 5 pages a week. I don't think so. but it was that weird, ambiguous thing of like, there's multiple people working on multiple issues trying to get ahead. So I don't think I was slow. I think I was reliable for a guy, right? I would say green, but I had been published. I had done a graphic novel, but I would say it took me a full month to draw the book. I could be wrong. There's thousands of pages between then and now.
Did you find yourself speeding up significantly as you went along, that you could I guess maybe have more confidence in yourself, skimp in the detail, and just maybe a little bit, not skimp is not the right word, but maybe not do as much detail, and then know that you can hit, a certain amount of pages per week, and make sure that there's no risk of not hitting the deadline?
On Joe, it was up and down. I have to admit, it was often daunting. Just, before you go to the drawing board and before you put a line on the paper, I got to dig up the reference on this guy and this guy and this guy and this tank and this vehicle. So it was daunting, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And some issues I think came out, easier than others because there was a through line. There was a lot of action. I mean, I picked up steam. I guess it was the invasion of Cobra Island, where they raise the island and Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow fight together. There was so much action in like those issues. It's like I drew the giant tidal wave splash page, which is an homage to the Japanese printmaker Hokusai. Oh my God, you guys are on the money. And I would say that, so it was always difficult and taxing in that, I had so many things. I was still weak in so many things that it was always daunting. I don't think I ever got up to speed in a way that made them happy. But there are some issues I look back on fondly. I like the fighter jet issue. I like the battle on Cobra Island. And there was a later issue that was with the Dreadnoks, the Thunder Machine. There was like an issue that was like a high-speed chase through most of the issue. And I look back fondly on that issue because I had a really clear through line on the action, and it kind of was easier to do.
Rod, you have worked with many different writers, and you have worked presumably from plot, quote, Marvel style, and also from full script. How was it to work with Larry Hama, and how has it been in your career to work Marvel method?
Well, Hama was Marvel method, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yes. Well, see, that was probably part of the problem for me to pick up steam, because of keeping track of everybody that was going to be in the book and all of that stuff, and sort of, trying to get a handle on the story and move along. As far as scripts go, I kind of prefer writers who do a full script, because, and this is not towards Larry, who knows what he's doing, or some writers, but some writers, I think, forget that they're writing a comic book and they think they're writing a novel. And because they're not forced to visualize what's going to go on the page, sometimes you can get a Marvel style script and it's murder, because they've simply you've got no breathing room because there's too much story. But also on the negative, on the flip side of that, when you have a writer who's doing a full script and they're not visual either, it's very restrictive. I kind of prefer full scripts simply because I think, it gets a little more work out of the writer. The writer has to focus a little more and understand what's going to be on the page. Like I've said, I really loved working with Chuck Dixon because he just gave you so much room. It's like 5 pages, 5 panels on a page, 5 panels on a page. Oh, this page is 1 panel. These 2 pages are 1 panel. The writer who I worked with, who actually taught me and made me a better artist, was when I went to DC. And I was off of Joe, and I wandered around the wasteland of Marvel. I was trapped in the new universe for a few. A sports comic book of all things, the least sports-minded guy. It was a superhero football player or something. That the one thing that was wonderful about that is that the editor on the book got me to, inked by an artist named Tony DeZuniga. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. He's an artist, comic artist, I think originally from the Philippines. Brilliant. I mean, just a fantastic artist. And I put my stuff in, and you develop a kind of tunnel vision sometimes. You're trying to figure out, how can I do this better? How can I do that better? And DeZuniga was just a master craftsman and a brilliant artist. And he inked my stuff, and he didn't redraw it, but when he inked it, he subtly changed everything. And when I saw the printed book, it was a revelation. There was so many bad habits that I had that DeZuniga just wiped out. And I wish I could say it applied it instantly, but it was a transformative event.
Can you give us an example of 1 or 2 of those bad habits, a specific?
Well, here's the primary weakness that happens with a lot of guys, and certainly for me, because I had no art education. I learned to draw from looking at comics, and you can learn a lot of good things from looking at the work of other artists, but you can also pick up bad habits, or it always helped. I never did any life drawing. I was intimidated by it. And that one of the things that he did is the way that I draw eyes. I'm trying to do Barry Smith's eyes, or I'm trying, and I was this hodgepodge of. A lot of times when you look at my work, you can look at my work and you say, there's Russ Heath, there's Wally Wood, that's Russ Manning, because these were, I don't want to lay the guilt on them, but they were my teachers, by default. And DeZuniga changed the way I did faces. There were just bad comic book art habits that I had picked up. And it's just like, oh my God, just this much of a change validates the drawing completely. And it was a great learning experience. And when I went to, so I wandered around the wasteland, the new universe, and then kind of went months without getting any work because, I was, stylization was really taking hold in comics. We were at the dawn of the age of the image look, stuff like that. And I was having a hard time finding work. And I was at a convention begging for work. And an art director from First Comics came along, and they had this project called Team Yankee. And it's an adaptation of a best-selling, that's a guy, Harold Coyle. He was kind of a Tom Clancy, but he wrote hardcore military stuff. And Team Yankee was a novel he wrote about what a land war in Europe between Russia and the Allies would be like. And they were trying to do this. And what was going to happen was it was going to be a 6-issue comic miniseries, and then Berkeley Books would publish it as a graphic novel. They'd combine it. And they were losing their mind because they had some guys who worked at First Comics, and they did samples, and they sent the samples to the writer, and he's like, what is this crap? Because, he didn't read comics. He didn't want to see soldiers that looked like superheroes. So they were going to throw the project away. And I'm at the con, and I wish I could remember the art director's name, but he's like, oh, you're G.I. Joe. You draw tanks, don't you? And I'm like, yes. And they had this project, and it was about to fall apart. And they said, well, would you do 2 sample pages so that we could see if we could get the writer on board to do this? So I did a 2-page combat sequence with an M1 Abrams tank. And, and I got it. I did all the detail. It's like, this is what the targeting system inside an Abrams tank looks like. And did my best Russ Heath haunted tank that I could do. And they sent it to the writer, and he said, oh, okay, now you can do it. I also did that with a Snake Plissken comic where they sent superhero stuff to John Carpenter, and Carpenter said, what is this crap? So they said, well, this was at Malibu. I was like, well, this isn't going to work. Who do we give it to? That Whigham guy. Okay. and John I sent the stuff. I did a likeness. I love Escape from New York. So I did some samples of Kurt Russell as Snake Plissken. They said, well, we can't afford to give Kurt any money. So can you draw Snake Plissken and make him? So I made him kind of a John Buscema looking guy, and then sent it to John Carpenter, and John Carpenter said, oh, okay, now you can do the comic book.
So wait, you were doing it to not use an actor likeness?
Yes. because they didn't apparently it would have cost them money to use Russell's
they had bought the rights to make a comic of this movie property, but not the additional rights to include the actor likeness.
Yeah. So, and this is the weird thing. I had tried with a few editors years before at Marvel to convince them to maybe try and do a Snake Plissken comic book. Because I love Escape from LA. I do not like, but I love Escape from New York. So, and I was utterly thrilled to do that. You know what? Here's another story. Where I came riding in at the last minute and saved the maiden. Malibu was going to do a Terminator miniseries, and it was going to start literally right at the end of Terminator 2. The first page of the first issue is Sarah Connor and John Connor driving down the highway at night, and Malibu had one of their guys, I don't know his name, but a superhero guy, and they sent it to Jim Cameron and the people that work with Jim Cameron, and they said, what is this crap? And so the people at Malibu said, well, would you maybe do a couple of sample? I had not realized how many times I had pulled people's asses out of the fire. Oh my God. So I did a 2-page sequence of Sarah Connor and John Connor driving down the highway as if right at the end of Terminator 2, the story keeps going. And there was a 2-page sequence. They drive up on a trailer, and one of Sarah Connor's old, underground contacts comes out and threatens them with a gun. So, okay, send it to them. James Cameron and the people there went, oh, okay, this is okay. You can do it now. So, that's kind of funny. Yeah, they couldn't have just picked me to begin with, So, God, I don't even know what the hell story I was telling now. But
I think you said that there was an editor or a writer at DC from whom you learned a lot.
Oh,
after you left Marvel. After
I did the Team Yankee, which.
So Team Yankee, for our listeners and viewers, that's 1988 and 1989. And you're doing Star Trek comics starting in 1990, I believe?
Yes. Well, no, what happened It's funny. And I was doing, I was out of work for forever. And then I got the Team Yankee job, but First Comics was barely surviving. And they were slow to pay, but I needed the money. And at a certain point, I'm in the middle of this project. And I think that's when I got some G.I. Joe fill-ins to do. It's ambiguous. But so I did Team Yankee, which is a 6-issue miniseries, realistic land war. I'm actually quite proud of that. It was, realistic soldiers, realistic combat. It was made in, and it's, you can occasionally find it in the trade paperback. I'm sure it's in a dollar bin somewhere. And then while I was trying to finish that up, and I had gone without work for 8 months, and then suddenly I'm getting work from everybody. And while I'm finishing up the Team Yankee project, Mike Carlin, who I had met at Marvel Comics a few years before, was working at DC and called me up and wanted to know if I wanted to try out to do Doc Savage, which I love Doc Savage. I don't have many pictures of my childhood, but there's a picture of me as a little kid. I don't know exactly when it was, but Bantam, I think it was Bantam, started reprinting the Doc Savage novels in paperback. So those fantastic covers by James Bama. And there's actually a picture of me as a dorky little kid with a flat top, and sitting on the table in the background is the first issue, the first printing of Doc Savage. So I'm like, oh my God, yeah, Mike, I'd love to do this. And he said, well, he's only going to do it for 6 issues, but Denny O'Neil is going to write it, because Denny wrote a miniseries with the Kubert brothers on Doc Savage. And I'm freaked out, because Denny's one of the great writers in American comics. I mean, Denny was brilliant. The Batman stuff he did with Neil Adams was amazing. And he's like, Denny's going to write like the first 6 issues. And if we can get together on this, and so I'm like vibrating, because there's that Wayne World thing of I'm not worthy. And I really wasn't. But I got Denny's scripts, and they were so brilliant in comic science. Denny's one of these guys. Well, he was one of those guys who, as a writer, completely understood the mechanisms of the page and telling the story. And I literally got better with every issue I drew, because the scripts were so good that I read them and I instantly saw them. And that was like a huge jump for me, was to work with Denny. I'm not throwing rocks at anybody else I've worked with, but that was somebody whose scripts struck a chord with me, and they were just so clear that I actually learned from it.
All right, so I can fix my timeline a little bit. Doc Savage runs 24 issues, starting in 1990, and Rod, you drew almost every issue, and Denny O'Neil did write the first 6, and
Yeah.
Star Trek comes after this, starting in 93.
Yeah. Well, I went to the Shadow after Doc Savage, which is a peculiar thing. At a certain point, DC was doing a Shadow comic that was being produced by Eduardo Barreto, who's a brilliant artist from Argentina, Uruguay, South American, wonderful artist, amazing guy. And DC decided, well, we've got Doc Savage, we've got the Shadow. This has never happened before. We're going to have a crossover, and we're going to have Doc Savage and the Shadow together. Now, the only pulp character that I love more than Doc Savage is the Shadow. So when I get the call from Mike Carlin, it's like, well, what you're going to do is you're going to do layouts, and Eduardo is going to do finishes. And I'm like, okay. And I like bounced off the walls for 2 days. And we did a 4-issue miniseries. Well, Mike Barr was writing Doc Savage at the time, and I think Gerard Jones was writing The Shadow. And I was doing layouts. Now, my layouts are what most people consider finished pencils. People say, well, you should loosen up. And I'm like, tell it to my brain. This is the way I see it. I go from doodle to the finished drawing. I don't do a lot of sketching in between. And Barreto was just amazing, and it was a wonderful experience. So Doc Savage got canceled, and at the same time that Doc Savage got canceled, Eduardo Barreto got offers of bigger books at DC. And so I got a call from Mike Harland, or I think maybe the editor on The Shadow. He said, well, you're out of work. You want to do The Shadow now? And I'm like, yes. So I went from Doc Savage for 2 years. I did The Shadow for a year. It was very interesting because I love all this stuff in the 1930s. I know, I'd read a lot of the Shadow stuff. So it was very exciting. I'm not going to, I don't like to run people down, but the guy that they put on as the inker was Eduardo Barreto's assistant. And I don't think he quite understood that you're not supposed to change the art. So he would take the scarf off the Shadow's face, and in a double issue murder mystery, there was a woman who's supposed to be kind of a somewhat over the hill showgirl who ends up being the villain in the end. So she was chubby. I made her look like the actress Joan Blondell, who's a lovely person. And he decided to redraw the woman to look like his girlfriend. So when you get to the second part of the story, this woman who's supposed to be in her early 50s, in the previous issue, looks like Farrah Fawcett. So, and it was a little upsetting. And the book, Michael Golden tried for a while to be an editor, and he took over The Shadow. And he's like, I like what you're doing. It's like, I have some suggestions. And I'm like, well, anything you want to say, I'm going to listen to. And he said, well, what do you think of the inker? And I said, well, I wish he wouldn't change things. And Golden was like, he changed things, and apparently fired the guy that day. I didn't go out to get him fired. And he said, I'll get you better inkers. And I'm like, okay, I'm down with that. So we did a few issues of The Shadow, and he finally got me to work with an inker named John Beatty. And Beatty's an excellent inker and completely understood what I was intending to do. So we did one issue together, and all the stuff that I had changed in my drawing, because I was trying to compensate for the inker who was previous, I threw that out, and we instantly clicked, and it was very exciting. And the sales on the book went up immediately. I actually got a royalty check, but with the sales going up, somebody at DC decided, well, they don't want to have licensed material anymore. So while the sales were going up, they canceled The Shadow, and it went to Dark Horse.
So here's
and God bless Michael Golden. I was out of work at The Shadow, and Golden knew that I met deadlines. I mean, I had been behind. At one point, I said, Mike, I've got to have a vacation. I got to have a week off. And he said, well, we're so close. He said, if you wanted to take a week off, you'd have to draw 2 issues in 1 month. And I said, okay. And he's like, yeah. And I did it. And he said, well, I can't believe it. You did it, and you didn't lose any detail or anything. You can go lay on the beach for a week. When The Shadow was canceled, he ran around and looked around DC and got me work. And they needed somebody to draw an issue of Star Trek. And it's been that thing over and over again. Well, you can draw tanks, but you can't draw this. And I'm like, yeah, I can draw that. If you can draw, you can draw. So it's like, oh, you're the old fashioned guy. So I got an issue of Star Trek to draw, and I like Star Trek a lot. And I like spaceships. I mean, the first thing I ever did that was published was science fiction. So I kicked out the jams on it, and then they gave me Star Trek. So, oh, you're the guy who draws old fashioned. You're the guy who draws tanks. Oh, you're the guy who draws this. You're the guy. Jake, I draw tanks. I draw Terminators. I draw 1936 Auburn Roadsters. Come on.
Can I ask? So you were referring to Denny O'Neil as the writer at DC from whom you learned so much.
Yep.
Did the two of you talk a lot, or was it just sort of you were getting the scripts?
I was getting the scripts.
Okay, but you didn't talk on the phone and bat
No.
stuff. Okay.
No,
So
I mean,
you were learning sort of by example and structurally about writing. Is that what you mean? The writer from whom you learned the most?
well, some writers have a good sense of pacing, and some writers have a good sense of drama, and some writers don't have either one, and some writers know how much can go onto a page, and some writers don't. Denny he absolutely understood everything about comics, the mechanics of it, not just the poetry, not just the dialogue, but he understood the mechanism of the story. So when you'd look at a page of script, it was just like you could just see it. There was no ambiguity. This panel here, you lead to this. This has to be the master shot. This is the page turner. And it's like you just, it's like working, with a great filmmaker, someone who knows how to write, someone who knows how to write a script and think visually. And no, I never talked to Denny. I mean, I met him at Marvel, and a few years ago he came down. He was getting an award at the Jimmy Carter Center, and I went down there to see him, just to tell him what he had done for me. But it was simply a process of, when you get the proper blueprint to build a house, there's, the house goes up. That's just what it is. And that's what it was with Denny. He, you could see his sense of drama, and you could understand that he knew where to give you breathing room, where to break the story on the page.
And as a contrast, working at Marvel on G.I. Joe, particularly with the Marvel method, where it's more you're given a description and the detail is left to you about how to construct the panels and the expression on a face, for example. Do you feel like you're almost the co-writer on a book like that, because there is so much that is left for you to interpret on the page yourself?
Yeah, I would say so. I would. Here's the deal. I'm not going to get involved in politics, and a lot of people have very deep feelings about the situation. But Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were the co-writers of everything they did at Marvel. And they just. Ditko got a little bit of credit sometimes. He really did. But that procedure is I think it's very difficult to not suggest that some aspects of the work that Kirby and Ditko did, they were not given credit for, and that they are largely a part of the entire Marvel universe being formed. So to me, it's always tricky to work from a Marvel style script. It really depends. Now, if it's something simple, if it's like a Daredevil, where you're tracking one or two figures through a sequence, it's not that difficult. But you really, when you're working for Marvel script, you really are, you're not just the director and the director of photography, but you're working on the script. So it's kind of complicated. I know some artists prefer that, But to me, I always kind of preferred a full script.
Can we jump ahead to 2010,
Can
2011?
we stay
Yes.
in the G.I. Joe era for a minute, Tim?
Well, I was going to ask about G.I. Joe covers.
Before we get to the modern era, just in that classic Marvel run, I saw in an interview you referenced that you were once flown to New York so that Larry could show you how to draw at high speed. Can you tell us about that experience?
No. No, yes, it was the learn how to draw a comic book overnight thing. Larry did that with a lot of artists. And you know what his idea was that, I mean, I think what he actually said at some point, he says you shouldn't spend any more time designing a page than it takes for a kid to read it. And I can't think that way. And I did do okay, but that was one of the worst days of my life. Because I don't go to cons to draw very much. I don't like being around people when I'm trying to work. I like my focus, and being in a room with a bunch of people that I don't know standing around looking over my shoulder. And it was a kind of torture for me. It was weird. It was very strange. I understand the validity of it, and when it's, you know, I think it was a Moon Knight story or something, and there were several people in there who were all drawing it. And when it's just one guy running around jumping on rooftops, yeah, I can do it that way. I learned to visualize, but at that point I was still so overwhelmed by everything. And I got to be honest, G.I. Joe was a pain in the butt to draw. I mean, you know, you've got all the equipment, you've got all these characters. It was very complicated. And, you know, it was just something that it was a long day. It was a very long day. Well, here's the best thing about it. I do see the validity of it, and I did do fairly well. And I'm like, and then I'm saying, well, it's one guy running around jumping on a rooftop. It's pretty easy to figure that out. It's not that complicated. But here's the thing: at the end of the day, that very day, when I was leaving this, I'm covered in sweat. I'm freaked out. I'm exhausted. I'm getting ready to leave. Marvel had 2 elevators. One of the elevators was down. So I had to wait for the other elevator to come up. So the one is being repaired. So the other elevator comes up. I get on the elevator. It's very crowded. There is a guy who had been in Marvel the whole day trying to get work as a writer. And he was devastated. You know, you take a lot of body blows in comics. I think people sometimes were just a little bit more blunt than they should be. But, you know, a lot of them live in New York, so that's just the way life is. When you're a wannabe and you're nervous and you feel out of your depth, that stuff can kind of wear on you. And he'd had a bad day. So he's literally in a corner, kind of crouched down and out loud going, I don't know why nobody doesn't like my work. I don't understand. I've been here all day. I'm like, oh my God, this is all the way down. And we got down between 2 floors, and the elevator that I was on broke between floors. So I had been in Marvel all day long with people all over my shoulders. And I am now trapped in an elevator with a writer who's about to have a nervous breakdown. And there's an older lady who reminded me very much of the woman who played Edith on the Archie Bunker show. Gene Stapleton. And when the elevator broke down, that's when I found out that she's claustrophobic. So what happens is that for almost 2 hours, I am trapped in the elevator between floors in Marvel Comics. And for an hour, they're trying to get it to go. And this woman is in hysterics. And this guy sitting in the corner is like, I don't understand. And I'm just like, all I want to do is get to Grand Central Station and go to that bar and have a drink. And after an hour of them working on it, we're listening, we're hearing this thing on the phone. And the guy who's talking on the phone turned around and said, they can't fix it. They have to fix the other elevator first and come up and get you. So for 2 hours, I'm trapped in an elevator with a claustrophobic old lady, and there's no air. They finally get the elevator up, and what they're going to do is they take out this panel, and we have to climb through to get into the other elevator. And the old lady, sorry, she's an old lady, really goes psychotic. But we finally get in there. We get down more than 2 hours after I left the Learn How to Draw a Comic in One Day kid class. I spent trapped in an elevator at Marvel and walked out into the streets of New York and said, maybe I could just walk into traffic and this day would be complete. And that's why I don't have particularly fond memories of that day, not just drawing and having people around me and trying to concentrate. At the end of all that, I was trapped in an elevator at Marvel for 2 hours. So that's the story that nobody ever told about the Learn How to Draw a Comic Book in One Day.
The elevator.
So
that's the inside scoop, kids.
Rod, after your G.I. Joe run, you work at Marvel, you work at DC.
Tim, can I linger on G.I. Joe a little bit longer? Sorry. So I had an example page, sort of just to illustrate something which really strikes me as I look at your pages, which is like the use of, the clarity of the storytelling over above anything else. There's never any doubt as to what is going on a Rod Whigham G.I. Joe page, but also the use of silhouettes to break things up and sort of just, I guess, just make the page. This isn't a good way of describing it. Make the page easier on the eye. So we've got, for example, the sequence here with Flint getting a beat down from the eels, and on another page we've got here some cobras rappelling down on the line, and just some great. Just each panel is so different, but also the use of blacks to make it pop is something that really strikes me.
Well, a lot of this, it's you want to mix up your design, but silhouettes, you're creating a mood, and it sort of breaks the amount of data into a different packet. It's like I learned an awful lot. Most of what I learned from storytelling, as far as drama, kind of comes from Joe Kubert. He's a great storyteller, and he was always, he would do surprising things. There'd be an intimate scene with somebody, and then suddenly he would pull the camera way back in the conversation. You would have these small figures in the distance, but you would see what was going on all around them. It's like the Tarzan stuff he did for DC was really beautiful that way. So it's drama. It also helps, it calms your eyes down. There's ridiculous amounts of detail and data on this stuff. Sometimes I was just too crazy, but it's drama.
I don't think we got a lot of this in the printed book. I think some of this nuance got lost.
Yeah. Well, G.I. Joe was the first book at Marvel where they started using the flexographic press, which was this super high speed press. and it just one of the worst innovations in printing period ever. And the colors were all so incredibly vivid. I mean, 100% yellow printed on that thing, you know, it would burn your retinas out. But it's drama. I watch a lot of, I'm a huge film fan, and I've always appreciated lighting and mood. And sometimes there's so much data going on that silhouettes give you something to focus on, and it pulls you into a different space in what's happening in the situation. I'm not putting this very clearly, but
Rod, if I may, I think part of what you're saying here is using different wording for what you said earlier, which is that every page you draw, but also this page in particular, is designed, that you're making choices. And as Mark said, sort of every panel is different. So we've got this, technically it's a long shot because we see the full bodies, this silhouette on the first panel. And then in the second panel, we've got this extreme long shot because we see sort of a bunch of people and all the stuff happening around them. But there's even information in the extreme foreground where we're looking past that sort of control console. And then there's this compositional element in both of the first two panels where there's some framing on the top. And then similarly in panels 3 and 4 and 5, the point of view keeps changing. The amount of information keeps changing, right? Panel 3 is intimate because we're right over his shoulder. Panel 2, we're separated by this, whatever it is, a sewer grate or a drainage pipe grate. And yet, to Mark's point, it's all completely clear. And I was thinking when you were talking about Gil Thorp at the beginning of our interview, because I looked at a few strips before we started talking, and, you know, these 3 tiny squares on weekdays, you know, a panel is like head and shoulders, and then another panel is a hand, and then another panel is a head and a shoulder, and then the person's head that they're talking to. And that's sort of all you get. And I was thinking as you were saying it, oh, Gil Thorp isn't drawn as much as it's designed. Like you're just carving up these squares into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 bits of information: shoulder, head, background, you know, hand, arm, soccer ball. And that's it. It's leaving space for the word balloon.
Yeah, well, and also you have to take in on a comic strip now that the size. I mean, a lot of people get them online, but I think they still are occasionally printed, physically printed in newspapers. I hope so. But you have these tiny spaces, and what you have to do is have a defined image. And you have to distill it down to what's the most important thing in the situation. And also, because I see a lot of people that draw comic strips now. I mean, it's sad that there's almost no adventure strips left. But a lot of people, you see it, and it's like, it's 2 people sitting talking. Then it's closer to 2 people talking. And then it's a closer person talking. And you're just getting fed this rote data over and over again, and it's uninvolving. So compositionally, that's really difficult to do. I mean, I mentioned briefly Alex Toth. I consider Alex Toth to be the best comic book artist that ever lived. I can get arguments with people. You know, I understand about that. But when it comes to the science, the composition to framing, I mean, if you want to see some really great comics, look at some of the romance comics that Alex Toth did in the 1950s, where it's My Young Love or True Romance or whatever these things were. And it's just storytelling of, you know, people meet, they fall in love, they have problems. It's incredibly mundane. But his framing, his design work, where he puts the camera, everything, these things, they're beautiful and they really stand out. And that was part of the problem I had to learn, was to learn how to think more clearly and make less work for myself, to not be too prosaic. And there's always that balance. The one thing that I have always kept in mind is that, and I think some writers and certainly some comic book artists lose track of this. You've read the script. You know what's going on. The person who's reading it doesn't. You've got to make sure that there's certain very important bits of information, data, to make the story work. And you always, whenever I draw anything, I'm like, what's going to make an impact, but also what's going to tell the story clearly. And I don't look at comics much anymore. And I think somebody once asked me to name the 4 most important things about drawing comics. And I'm such a wise fellow. And I said, first of all, storytelling. Secondly, storytelling. Third, telling the story. 4, pretty drawings. I mean, all the beautiful drawings. I mean, there's so many artists, it's just amazing how skillful people are and beautifully drawn there. But I often don't see drama. I don't see thinking in the storytelling. And so I can't get engaged in it. I would rather have somebody that draws kind of mediocre and tells a great story than somebody who draws beautifully and you don't know what's going on.
For our listeners and viewers who want to learn more about Alex Toth, IDW published 3 amazing coffee table history books on Alex Toth, written by Dean Mullaney and Bruce Canwell. They were in hardcover, and by the time, viewers and listeners, you are hearing or seeing me say this, the softcover of the first one, Genius Illustrated, will be out.
Well, that's good news. I've got them. I've got every collection of every compilation of Alex Toth's work that anybody's done. I mean, I just idolize his work. He's like Miles Davis. He's like one of probably the greatest jazz musician who ever lived. He utterly and completely understands every aspect of comic art and distills it down to the bare minimum. And you can get caught up with, paying attention. I put way too many lines on stuff. I got caught up in that sort of thing. But if you can do a successful drawing with 5 lines instead of 25 lines, you've won. You've done the job.
So, bringing it back to the G.I. Joe Marvel era again, there's this incredible run sort of covering just a little over kind of two years on the book, which for me is my favorite period of the entire run of G.I. Joe, and this is coming from someone who likes G.I. Joe an awful lot. What's sort of talking to the end of that run? What was it that led to you exiting the book?
Sheer exhaustion. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would be surprised if before I got on G.I. Joe, I don't know how many artists drew multiple issues in a row. It seemed to, I think up until a certain point, I certainly held the record. And for a while, I was burned out. It was very exhausting. I had gone through a drawn out process in my personal life during the midst of all of this. And I was constantly asking as politely as possible, could we please have a fill-in? Because I need to have go lay on a beach for a week or 2 weeks or, that sort of thing. And I was just simply burned out, and it was getting harder and harder to do it. And, it's a difficult book to get somebody to draw. I mean, I was at a convention once, and a guy who was drawing one of Marvel's superhero books was like, oh, your royalty checks must really be something. I'd like to have some of that action. And I said, hey, talk to your editor. I'll talk to mine. Let me draw an issue of Spider-Man or whatever it was, and you can draw an issue of G.I. Joe. And he's like, that's okay. And I'm like, yeah, because he didn't want to do the work. And at a certain point, and I got a call and I said, look, part of it was that the book was selling really, really well. And I take it that I was popular on the book. And if I was off the book, maybe that would affect the sales. I don't think so. But it's just difficult to find somebody to be willing to take on that load. Because most artists, you say, hey, how would you like to draw 22 pages of tanks and aircraft and 30 different characters? And they'll go, no, thank you. They want to draw Spider-Man or something. And a new editor took over. That editor, I have later heard stories, and this is hearsay, that he had a habit of, when he took over a book, he wanted it to be his deal, and moved new people in. But I was incredibly burnt out, and I was told that I wasn't going to get a fill-in. So it was just, I was just kind of used up.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then when a new editor took over, and they're like, well, you've got to, we don't want to part ways, sourly, but, we need new blood. And I'm like, yes, so do I,
So Rod,
Mm-hmm.
in 2010, all right, so you do those 3 issues, you do a fill-in,
and then you came back again for a bit.
yeah, so you do a fill-in, and then you come back and you do a 3-issue arc, and then the book ends, and you're drawing other things. And in 2008 you start, and G.I. Joe ends 2008, you start drawing a daily newspaper strip, and in 2010 G.I. Joe comes back with the same writer picking up where it left off, and you are hired as a cover artist for about the first year, and you hadn't done covers for G.I. Joe before. So can you talk about this?
Well, I think was the regular cover, or were there variant covers? I cannot remember if there were covers for the same issue by other artists. I could never keep track of that.
Yeah, there were 3 covers for each issue. The guy drawing the interiors was drawing a cover. You were doing a cover, and then there was a Larry Hama sketch cover.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm supposing, I never heard the inside of it. I'm supposing going to have to be that Larry put me up for it. That doesn't suck too much.
Or maybe
a good one.
Or maybe the editor thought, we should have another link to the original run that'll pull people in.
That could be a decision that was made too.
Is it that there isn't much story here? You're an illustrator for hire. Here was a job. Here was something you could do, and you did it.
That was kind of it. That was, as far as I know. Now, at a certain point, there was supposed to be there was going to be an IDW issue with multiple artists. I think Herb Trimpe, I think, was going to do work on it. Ron Wagner was going to do work on it. And they asked me. Larry was going to write a script. And the editor on the book called me up, called me up and said, we're going to do this special issue, and everybody's going to tell part of the story. Would you like to do that? And I'm like, well, yeah. Your checks are clearing. You bet. and it's, there was a certain bit of, I know this is going to sound weird. I never thought I was doing a good job on G.I. Joe. I feel like an artist is like a shark. The minute you stop moving, you drowned. You're done. You've always got to get better. So I've always worked hard. So I look back on that stuff and I'm like, oh God, why did I do that? Why did I do this? Blah, blah, blah. And the book was very popular, and I never really felt like I was giving people enough. So when I got offered to do these covers, I said, I'll go back, and I don't suck as much as I used to. and I'll lean into it, and all these people that have been so fond of, the work I did on that, maybe I can do something a little better. And that's what it was. And I kind of enjoyed it. And I didn't get to do covers. I mean, it wasn't, covers are, if you're not there on the spot in companies like Marvel, DC, I mean, they have a lot of artists who are there and can turn covers around. But
Mark, can you go forward to 164?
Right.
Is that Tommy Lee Jones?
A little bit. There's
Okay.
something like it. It was an evil guy.
Then,
The editor wanted me to do a variation on the movie poster for Face Off.
Huh.
That movie with Nicolas Cage and
Travolta.
John Travolta.
So Rod,
one of the worst movies ever made. Oh my God.
Rod, you're referring to an issue that Larry would write and like Trimpe and Wagner and you would draw.
Yes.
Did you end up working on that issue?
No, I did not. That's an interesting thing. That's so the editor, whose name I cannot recall at the time, said, would you like to do this? And I'm like, yeah, I'm all in on it. It would be cool, and like I said, it's like, okay, I don't suck as much now. This would be nice. This would be nice for the people that have supported my work. And, it would be, I could maybe have fun with it. And so I agreed to do it. And the guy says, great, I'm going to get you a script. Larry's working on it now. I'll get you the script. And some time passes. I did a couple more covers, and I contacted the editor and said, well, what happened to that script? And he's like, oh, there's a little bit of a delay. He's still working on it. Do you still want to do it? And I'm like, yes. I said I wanted to do it. It's a dumb thing to say, but I gave my word. A man's word is his honor. Yeah, okay, great. We'll do that. And then I stopped getting covers, and then the editor didn't return my phone calls, and somebody else did the part that I was supposed to do, even though I had been asked to do it twice and had agreed to do it twice. So I don't know what the story is on that.
Maybe this was the yearbook, perhaps.
Yeah, this is yearbook 2012, which was penciled by Ron Frenz, Ron Wagner, Herb Trimpe, and inked by, some of the inks were by Sal Buscema. I'm trying to think, is that when, Mark, was there an editorial change?
There were a few, yeah.
Rod, I don't have my timeline in front of me, and this is a guess. You may have just been a casualty of an editor change who wasn't tracking where things had been. I'm not saying it was malicious, and I might be wrong anyway.
No, I don't think it was malicious. I've never suspected that. I mean, I'm kind of the girl at the dance that nobody asks. It's like, and I'm great on the dance floor. I'm just not good looking.
And Rod, 2 times you have drawn not just a sketch or a pinup or sort of a cover that may have been, but a story as a commission for a fan. 2 different times, or maybe 3 different times. So that's a level of artist commission that is uncommon.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah, one was like a 7-page story, I think, and one was an entire, I think, almost a full issue's worth of work. And in both situations, I was told by the person that commissioned it that it was going to be printed. It was going to be printed under the purview of Hasbro, and that money wasn't going to be made out of it. I got paid for the work, which that's exciting. That's always good when that happens. I don't always get paid, but and nothing ever came of either one of them. But it was an odd situation. It was someone who, I think someone was hoping to do like a fan published version of Joe that it was supposedly approved by Hasbro or whoever. And so, yeah, so that's 2 complete stories. Well, one was a short story, but yeah, I penciled and inked them, did the whole art job on it, and did get paid, and nothing ever became of them.
In a previous interview, I've heard you referring to this, and I don't know if it's the same thing, but you referred to around about year 2000, 2 stories that were never published, which were Budo on a Desert Island and Scarlet in Springfield. Is this the same thing?
Yeah, those are the 2 stories.
And then more recently, you drew a 3-page story or a cover and a 2-page story. Mark, help me out. Finish this sentence for me.
Was it 5 pages for Alman Ellis about his character?
Oh yeah, Alman Ellis. Yeah, I've forgotten about that.
Wise guy.
Yeah. He had me design characters. I think he's had a lot of other artists do stuff on this, but he, I think Ron Wagner's done some work for him.
That's right. He did the cover.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so he was like he was literally paying professionals to produce comic books about him as a Joe character. And the story I did was like an adventure, a little bit of adventure of how he gets brought into, he's officially made a Joe. Yeah. And it started off like 2 pages, and he said, no, I need a little more, and I need a little more. And then he said, when I'm like, okay, this, and I said, but it's like, it sort of just stops. You need like a last page. And then I suggested a last page, and which was like him in uniform skydiving into the camera out of the back of a Hercules with a couple of other members of the Joes. And he's like, and here I go, kind of thing. And so I don't know if that was published, if it was pure self-gratification.
He has put it online for people to see, and we've had him on an episode. So I have a quick question, Rod, and then Mark has a quick question. So Rod, you are for hire for people who want commissions and sketches, yes? And if they had several pages worth of continuity, you might draw a story for them for money?
Oh yeah, I might do that.
Okay. And Mark?
my question here on the screen, we've got an example of someone paying you money to have a drawing. This is one that you did for Chief for the Talking Joe podcast back when he was the main presenter of Serpentor. I want you to listen to this podcast. Yes. So my question was that the G.I. Joe license is now changing hands in the publisher. So it's been at IDW for a long number of years now, and their stint has finished, and we're sort of waiting to find out who the new publisher is, and there are industry rumors of who that might be. It might be Skybound or could be somebody else. So with a new publisher, kind of new ideas, new directions. If they were to ask you if you were still interested in drawing something G.I. Joe, what would the answer back be?
Sure. I'd be in for it. And I'm a cheap date. Ask anybody who gets commissions from me. I've had people literally argue with me saying you're not charging enough. Yeah. And I'm like, well,
can we not pay you more? Exactly.
Can we not pay you more? That doesn't happen very often in this world, quite frankly. But my feeling is people who have been loyal to my work and who have an emotional connection to my work, most of them are working class, regular old people, and I'm not gonna, try and bill them publisher rates, because I'm enjoying it. It's fun. I like doing pieces of art for people, that's going to be in their home. That's going to be, they're going to be part of. You enjoy it. So yeah, I can't imagine that would happen, but I'd be up for it.
There we go. Here's one of mine. Here we go. Snake
Oh yeah,
Eyes,
I remember
issue
that. That was sort of the
31.
greatest
Tribute.
hits of that issue.
So, Mark, tell us what this is. I see a page with 4 panels. This is a recreation.
This is a greatest hits from issue 31. So basically, I said, can we have some sort of montage of some of those greatest bits with Snake Eyes as the lead character? So we've got Firefly on the top of the roof of the cabin, Destro down, and Fred down below with Airborne and Spirit, and then Snake Eyes in the middle. And the Snake Eyes is an entirely new composition. He doesn't appear in this what's the right words, in this
original
pose
issue. Oh, sorry.
He doesn't appear in the this sort of pose in the commission in the original issue. So it's it's like almost like a cover that could have been perhaps for the comic. So,
it was just basically picking particular high points in the story and making a montage page out of it. The Firefly on the roof thing is it's pretty much exactly the same panel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is, but over the years, I've had any number of people tell me how much they love that panel. And it's a guy lying on a roof, but I guess the physicality of it, or I don't know what it is, but that particular that scene in that issue, people have expressed an affection for.
Yeah, I think it's because we get to see Firefly as a full figure character there, and doing the thing that he is is meant to be his speciality, which is his sort of destruction and explosives. So see that, and he's one of those fan favorite characters who sort of hasn't been used anywhere near as much, I think, as people would like. So to see him, all of him doing the thing that he should be doing, which is blowing things up, I think a lot of people sort of respond to.
Well, he's one of the favorite characters I ever drew. I liked the book early on when they were still recognizable as soldiers, and I liked, he's a sapper. He's the guy that goes in behind the lines and plants explosives and stuff. I always liked Flint a lot because he really looks like a soldier, with the beret and the bandoliers and everything. I always like the characters that look like soldiers. But boy, yeah. See, I'm looking at this. I actually don't hate it. I kind of have fun.
I am getting short on time. Mark, shall we wrap up with any final comments?
So I mean, my final comment was it's sort of great to spend this time hanging out, hearing the stories. Very privileged, sort of, big fan of comics, big fan of G.I. Joe, but those issues that you worked on in the issue 30, 40, 50s, sort of just lightning in a bottle for me, sort of a magic period for G.I. Joe and comics in general. So very big privilege to sort of talk to you about that era. Any final thoughts about sort of reflections looking back on your time at G.I. Joe?
Well, I honestly really appreciate what you said. I mean, I think it was a difficult time in my life. It was a difficult book to do, and I sometimes think I didn't quite appreciate what it meant to people, to kids, as much as I could have. I think I probably would have enjoyed it more, but it's an interesting, it's a strange thing. I mean, I always felt like I kind of got shoved on stage at Carnegie Hall, and I only knew 2 chords. I didn't really have enough going on in my work to sort of validate. But kids really loved it. I mean, you guys still love it, and so that means something to me. I just wish, looking back on it, that maybe I'd had my head a little farther out of my caboose. But life gets in the way of things, and it was interesting. And there, the thing about Joe that I liked is that it wasn't a fan favorite comic. It was a comic book that kids who weren't really into comics loved. It was the kind of comic book that kids would read it and they'd trade it with their buddies, and they'd roll up, and it's the way comic books used to be before they became high art. And it was it was kind of a wonderful thing. I mean, I'm looking back on it now. It's like I wish I could have appreciated it more. But what can I say?
And Rod, if someone was to try and find you online or ask for a commission, what would be the best way of doing that?
I'll just give you my email. It's rodwhigham54@gmail.com. I that's the simplest way to do it. And I'll do I do commissions. I'm perfectly happy to do it. The one thing I will say is I will not take, people want to send me their entire collections of books or things that they've had done. I don't want to do that. And for the only reason for that is I don't want responsibility for somebody else's property.
You don't want to sign them, you mean?
No. I don't want them to ship. If I'm on a con, I'll sign them.
Yeah.
But I don't want people to send me stuff that's their property, and then I have to be responsible for it, because I get run over by a bus or hit by lightning. The last thing in my head's going to be, oh no, I've still got that guy's books.
Rod, will you be appearing at any conventions in 2023 that you know of?
I have to think about that,
because I see a drawing table behind you that might be calling on Monday.
Yeah, I'm still iffy about being around people. In 2003, I had a very exotic kind of heart surgery to deal with an undetected birth defect. So now that I'm an old guy, I'm one of those people that I don't need to get even the mildest form of COVID. I don't need to get the flu. I'm vaccinated and boosted and all of that. So I have to seriously think about it, because it is, according to my doctor, it's a risky situation to be in.
So the best way for fans to meet you is through email for now.
Yeah, at the moment. There is a convention in Augusta, Georgia, in June, I think, that they've asked me before, and I'm trying to figure out some way whether I could be comfortable or not there. And wearing a hazmat suit, or a rebreather. But at the moment, the best way to get a hold of me is through my email. And it's my email. It's not, I can't ignore it. But like I said, I don't want to take a responsibility for people's property. If I was at a con, I'll sign anything. I once had a guy come to a convention with a computer printout, and he had every single thing I had ever done that had been published, except for a couple of paperbacks I illustrated. And I sat there and signed them all. Just like, you put bread on my table, you fed my family, sure, I'll sign. But I just don't want to, I don't want someone's property.
Rod, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us and telling us stories, and in many cases telling us the longer and detailed version of the story. We like the longer and detailed versions of the stories, and our episodes tend to go pretty long.
Yeah, well, I rambled on. I hope you get some usable footage out of all this, but
it's all usable. It is an entire episode. Mark, shall you wrap us up?
Uh,
Mark, you're
I-
muted.
we've lost you.
No, that was me stopping background noise from coming in. So,
Oh,
Tim, where can people find you when you are not talking to me and illustrious guests about G.I. Joe?
Video essays on television and film at our YouTube channel, Atomic Abe Productions. My brick and mortar comic book store is in Somerville, Massachusetts, Hub Comics, and I write about G.I. Joe at arealamericanbook.com.
And if you are listening to or watching this, you've probably found us already, but talkingjoe.co.uk is the place to find out more. It's the website with links to all of our things, weekly podcasts and fairly frequent videos. So I think that is us done. Big thank you to Rod for joining us and talking to us for quite some time. Thank you for being generous with your time, which leaves me just to say that I think we are done. And Tim,
Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
that's us done.
boy, I need a
Laters.
drink.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.